This is the story of John Ward, an aging English sailor who rose to become one of the most infamous pirates of the era, terrorizing the waters of the Mediterranean in the service of the Barbary corsairs of North Africa.
It's a pretty remarkable situation to go from essentially nothing to becoming a powerful figure.
He was increasing in wealth all the time, in power. He had hundreds of men working for him.
4 centuries later, his story lives on in popular culture as inspiration for the most famous fictional pirate of the 21st century, Captain Jack Sparrow.
He did what he did for himself. He wasn't bowing to any authority.
So how did a penniless fisherman leave a legacy that reached across the Mediterranean and beyond to become the Pirate King? John Ward is born near the small town of Faversham on the southeast coast of England. As a commoner and a fisherman, his days are spent at sea, scraping a grueling, dangerous living to provide a meagre existence for he and his wife.
Fishing was quite a hard life, quite hard work for seasonal returns. It wasn't always guaranteed that you would have enough fish even to feed your family, let alone sell and make profit.
In 1585, Ward spots an opportunity. War with Spain is brewing, and Queen Elizabeth I lacks the resources to build a navy to defeat the powerful Spanish Empire. Her solution? Outsource her fleet, allowing any English sailor to ravage Spanish ships, seizing their cargo. A share of the plunder must go to the crown, but the rest, the men are allowed to keep.
Conditions for those taking to sea, ordinary seafarers, if you will, was incredibly harsh. It was not guaranteed that you would get money. It was a hard life. It was very risky, of course. It was very dangerous. You were away for a long time from your families.
Despite this, thousands of civilians take to the sea in search of their fortune. Seasoned fishermen, experienced sailors, but also many men who had never left dry land. English law defines these adventurers as legal raiders, private men of war. But to the Spanish merchants who feared attack, they were simply pirates.
The attraction of privateering or even piracy, the risks of that were worth it.
John Ward is amongst those willing to take such a perilous risk. Leaving behind an arduous and unreliable fishing trade, he spends 18 years at sea thriving as a privateer. Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603 brings Ward's rise to an abrupt halt. Her successor, King James I, is determined to restore peace with Spain.
James was not a fan of privateering. In fact, when he was King of Scotland, he was constantly annoyed by the harassment against Scottish shipping. And so when he took over as king, he made a clear decision that he was going to eradicate privateering from England.
Overnight, private men of war are redefined as criminals, outlawed by the English crown.
Spain's ships are to operate unhindered by privateers, and he introduces quite severe punishments for that.
There was no longer support by the crown anymore to perform acts of violence at sea.
You now had official captains and commanders and men who were legitimate sailors now out of work. And while some of them were able to find employment elsewhere, the majority of them had no recourse but to turn to piracy.
Ward is unemployed and now aged 50. The battle-scarred sailor's options are limited. Join the King's Navy on the promise of a small salary. Continue raiding the Spanish as a pirate and risk the gallows if caught. Or return to the hard graft of life as a fisherman. Ward chooses the Navy and is placed aboard a ship, the Lion's Whelp.
Naval conditions aren't great. The rations are poor, pay is low or non-existent, discipline is very harsh.
For some sailors, especially young and inexperienced ones, going into the Navy might have had advantages. The ships spent a lot of time in port because they were so expensive that the monarch didn't want to send them out unless it was totally necessary. And the labour was shared out because naval ships often had very large crews. But for an experienced sailor like Ward, it would have been less than ideal. He could have earned much higher wages in a merchant ship or in a plundering ship, and he could have had opportunities to trade or enrich himself that he wouldn't get in a naval ship.
Almost immediately, Ward seems to seriously regret his decision.
2 weeks on, and Ward really isn't happy.
Ward hits breaking point. In a nearby tavern, a plot is hatched. He rallies his shipmates, urging them to abandon the Navy and flee the country. He's clearly persuasive, convincing them that they will be free men upon reaching the high seas. Led by Ward, the deserters decide to steal a small ship from Portsmouth Harbour.
This is quite a risky endeavour. If they're caught, there would be severe punishment.
Desertion is a crime in martial law, and seizing a bark and sailing off is piracy. But Ward knows there are great opportunities out there.
Ward and his men creep through the harbour, overpower 2 watchmen and seize control of the ship. Weighing anchor, they set out to sea. These deserters from the English Navy, now seafaring criminals labelled by the authorities as pirates.
Shortly after setting sail, Ward is chosen as captain by the men who've accompanied him. So pirates certainly had more say over who was in charge than you would get on a Navy ship where the commanders were appointed by the state. To be chosen so quickly shows that Ward must have been able to persuade and lead those who had followed him, and indeed he apparently persuaded them to steal the bark in the first place. And I think it also speaks to his experience as a navigator and as a sailor. They must have respected that he would be able to take them where they wanted to go.
They steal a ship called the Violet, and then they decide to sail off to the Mediterranean.
By 1603, the area is made up of a patchwork of feuding states and societies with high levels of piracy. Conflict rages between the Muslim states of the Ottoman Empire and the Christian principalities of southern Europe, with much of the fighting taking place at sea. Because of this, the region offers major opportunities for Ward.
He knows that the Mediterranean is a centre of really lucrative trade between cities like Venice and Genoa, Aleppo, Izmir. And he knows that there are plunderers already active in the Mediterranean. There is the Corso, the conflict between Islam and Christianity, from which we get the word corsair. And various ports in the Mediterranean are sending out raiders to capture shipping. So Ward knows that if he heads for the Mediterranean, he's going to be able to get in on this scene.
If you look at the geography of the Mediterranean world and North Africa, you have areas where pirates could have found a safe haven.
By the time Ward arrives in the Mediterranean, certain ports have become particular centres for maritime raiding. Places like Salé on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli and Tunis on the north coast of Africa, and also Malta.
To survive, Ward needs ships. He begins to build his fleet, stealing a 32-gun Dutch flyboat. Rather than killing the crew, Ward forces them to sail home in his own far smaller vessel. He renames the captured ship the Gift. His career as a Mediterranean pirate is underway.
Pirates took ships through shock and awe tactics. So they might battle with a ship, but quite often it was drawing up alongside and just being so violent and so aggressive. You know, the hope was that people would surrender. So he's off pirating around the Mediterranean, taking an increasing number of ships. And these ships have cargo, luxury goods, textiles, cotton, velvet, silk, spices, dyes, anything that is being traded through the Mediterranean region, Ward is taking. So the ships that were used in the Mediterranean region were fast sail ships, xebecs, for example, so square-rigged lateens. And these also had people on oars, it wasn't just sail power.
After months at sea and with a small fleet at his command, Ward now searches for a friendly port to unload his stolen cargo.
Ward heads first for Algiers, which he knows is one of these major centres for plundering. The problem is that an English pirate has very recently attacked ships in the harbour of Algiers, so English sailors are not particularly popular, and when Ward sails in, he's arrested and threatened with a death penalty. He manages to talk or indeed buy his way out by offering the plunder that he already has in his hold. So he loses everything that he's got from the voyage so far except the ships themselves. That means he can keep on going, and he sails on to Tunis, where he gets a much more favourable reception from the local ruler.
(1605). Ward sails into Tunis, a city ruled over by the feared former soldier Kara Osman Dey, leader of a powerful guild of corsairs, elite North African pirates who prey on ships across the Mediterranean.
When Ward sails into Tunis, the Dey sees an opportunity.
Kara Osman pays a quarter towards stocking Ward's ship, puts some of his own men on the ship, and the agreement is that Ward will sell the stolen goods to Kara Osman, who will store them, and then sell them back to English merchants at a huge profit.
Ward and Kara Osman have a deal. The Dey would take a percentage of any goods captured, and with the former soldiers' backing, Ward could begin to establish his name as one of the most notorious pirates in the Mediterranean. Ward and his fleet set sail alongside North African corsairs, attacking and seizing vulnerable ships.
Ward confines his activities to the Mediterranean region. He doesn't venture out of the Mediterranean to go further afield to pirate. He has rich pickings where he is. He's ideally situated for Christian shipping.
The corsairing vessels, the xebecs, are well known in the Mediterranean. But here is a European ship with a European crew. So it may be able to approach target vessels without arousing suspicion. And this is a really useful advantage when plundering in these shipping lanes.
Ward would have had a small fleet of ships, But these would have been, merchant ships that he would have captured, that he would have then put ordnance on them and armed them and made them into his men of war.
1606. Having left Tunis, Ward spots and seizes a merchant vessel.
He encounters a ship called the John the Baptist, which he renames the Little John, almost certainly a reference to Robin Hood, that great hero of the oppressed and the downtrodden who was very popular in this era. Just as he did with his naval shipmates in Plymouth, Ward now persuades the crew of the Little John to stay with him. He must have had a great style of talking. He must have been able to compel and encourage these people to follow him in his piratical career.
Yet again, Ward uses his powers of persuasion, convincing the crew of this merchant ship to join him in a life of piracy.
This feeds into a sort of later narrative about Ward, that he is an outlaw, an anti-hero, somebody who's taking on authority and actually to the benefit of the poorer sections of society. And what we certainly have is evidence that he was paying to release captives, he would help out poor English sailors that found themselves in difficulty, and he was recruiting and making wealthy ordinary sailors. Ordinary seafarers would have seen his successes as well as heard about them. He would have had English sailors, he would have had Dutch sailors, and he would have had Islamic sailors. There is, of course, evidence that he is a leader, that he is keeping his crew together. His life, really, is focused on his ships, his crew, his men, gathering more wealth, and his pirating activity.
Only a few years have passed since his flight from the Navy, but Ward is now rich and successful. And yet he still wants more.
Once he's captured the Little John, Ward goes on to capture several other ships, including the Ruby and the Carminotti, both Venetian ships, both very valuable, and he brings these back to Tunis, and this only raises his standings with the Dey. With the support of the Dey, Ward fits out 4 ships: the Little John, the Ruby, the Carminotti, and the Gift. He's provided with cannons, with swords, with muskets, with all of the tools of the pirating trade. While these preparations were ongoing, Ward and his men would have been leading something of a high life in Tunis. This was a cosmopolitan port. It was a trading port as well as supporting corsairs. There would have been merchant ships. There would have been people from all over the Mediterranean rubbing shoulders on the docks. And so these sailors would have found it very easy to get along in this society. They were used to places like this. And they just got a lot of plunder, so they had cash in their pockets. There were lots of different things they could have found to do with that cash. There would have been taverns, there would have been brothels, there were probably other kind of intoxicant drugs available as well. But that's not the whole story, because they may have established links with the local community, they may have made friends, some of them may have married. Ward builds up his position in Tunis through his relationship with the Dey. The Dey gives him a place to stay, and also a role in the treasury, which might to us seem like a strange job to give to a pirate, but the economy of these cities was so heavily involved in maritime raiding that actually it probably made a lot of sense, because Ward was contributing to the treasury on each voyage where he brought back more plunder.
Ward and Cara Osmond Dey grew close. To his friends, Captain John Ward goes by Jack, but legends say the Dey had another nickname for him. Ward has a tattoo on his arm, the classic mariner's image of a swallow, given to sailors when they've travelled 5,000 nautical miles. But the swallow is unknown to the Dey, so instead he calls him Sparrow. Captain Jack Sparrow. Following months of preparation, Ward sails from Tunis with a fleet of 4 ships. They're headed for a busy Adriatic Sea on the promise of merchant ships bound to or from Venice, one of the wealthiest states on the globe. But they're hit by a ferocious storm. 2 boats are lost. Ward and the survivors press on. April 26th, 1607. Ward spots an enormous vessel. It's the Reniera e Sodorina, one of the finest and largest ships in the Venetian fleet, carrying passengers and a huge cargo of valuables.
Cargo from the Sodorina was estimated to have been worth up to £2 million. This consisted of textiles, luxury goods, cotton, silk, indigo, dyes, spices such as cinnamon. Clearly, this was a huge amount of cargo for Ward. It was a huge coup for Ward.
Designed to be pirate-proof, the sheer size and firepower of the mighty Sodorina is a deterrent to those used to preying on smaller, lighter vessels. But Captain John Ward is not your average pirate. Despite having lost half his fleet, he opts to attack. A gentle wind blows that day, not enough to shift the massive Sodorina, but plenty to move Ward's ships to within firing range.
This was quite easy for Ward to kind of draw up alongside.
Ward opens fire. Cannonballs splinter the hull. The Venetians fire back, but Ward is already on the move, skillfully traversing the waves, shifting his ships out of range. For 3 bruising hours, he pummels the Sodorina, before ordering his men to stand by to board. In a desperate dash to the quarterdeck, the Sodorina's survivors prepare to repel the pirates. A moment before he issues the command to attack, Ward calls for his gunners to fire off a round of chain shot.
A chain shot is 2 cannonballs combined with a chain, and it's a particular weapon used to damage masts and rigging.
Tearing through the Sodorina's rigging, its men are thrown 30 feet to their deaths. Others are ripped to pieces in an instant. Terrified survivors are cut down by the pirates who now board the disabled ship. John Ward has just become master and commander of one of the finest ships ever to grace the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the sole possessor of the substantial wealth it holds. He has no sense of the political tempest he's just unleashed.
That is, in a way, his biggest success, but it might be the start of his downfall as well. Ward really seems to achieve a degree of notoriety when he captures the Reniera e Sodorina. But the problem he has, and this is something you often find with piracy, is he creates a diplomatic crisis.
When the Venetians learn that their precious Sodorina has been stolen by an English pirate, they furiously turn their gaze to King James, demanding compensation for their stolen treasures. James still fancies himself the great peacemaker of Europe, but this renegade fisherman turned Barbary corsair has sullied the king's mission. To prevent a war with Venice, the exasperated monarch sends a fleet of pirate hunters into the Mediterranean in search of Ward. Sensing danger, Ward sends a share of goods stolen from the Sodorina back to England in an attempt to negotiate a royal pardon.
This is common in a lot of cases of piracy. If you've got the goods, you can negotiate if they give you a pardon. If you don't have the goods, then you have absolutely nothing to negotiate with if they try and prosecute you.
In Tunis, Ward finds a ship called the Husband that's bound for London. The captain has no idea his ship is being loaded with stolen goods.
While the ship is in Tunis, many bundles of goods are put onto the ship, along with a lot of different passengers, which seem to a lot of them be English, and they're bringing a lot of money.
The Husband departs Tunis on a course for England. But the Venetians have figured out Ward's plan. As the ship nears port, it's suddenly stopped in its tracks.
The Venetians effectively arranged for the ships to be seized, and that completely destroyed any negotiating position that Ward had with the cargo.
With Ward's leverage now in the custody of his Venetian enemies, King James refuses his pardon, unwilling to risk war with Venice. Ward knows he can never again return home to England. Despite this setback, Ward plans a spree of raids across the Mediterranean with one of the region's mightiest weapons now at his disposal, the Sodorina. Sparing no expense, he transforms the merchant vessel into a deadly battleship, carving new ports into her hull to accommodate 70 brass guns. Ward goes on a recruitment drive, bringing together a fighting force of over 400 sailors and soldiers. They set sail in early 1608, soon capturing 2 English ships and a French merchant vessel. But then a storm hits. The expensive alterations Ward made have fundamentally weakened his prize ship's timbers. As rain and waves batter the Sodorina, it begins to break apart.
Unfortunately, the Sodorina does sink with a great loss of life. So 250 Englishmen and 150 Muslims actually perish on that ship when it sinks.
Ward is assumed dead amongst the wreckage. But the pirate is very much alive. Making his careful escape in one of the smaller vessels of his fleet, returning to Tunis, he faces a reckoning. The men who perished aboard the Sodorina are the husbands, fathers, uncles and brothers of many Tunisians. How did the captain miraculously survive whilst their loved ones perished? Ward seals himself in his mansion to avoid the outrage of the people, increasingly dependent on Kara Osman Bey for protection. But rather than flee the city under the cover of darkness, Ward makes a bold decision. In 1610, he converts to Islam. As is custom, he selects a new Muslim name, Yusuf Rias. Ward's Christian English life is over for good.
Essentially, one just simply had to renounce one's religion and change their name to become Muslim. In England, this was considered one of the worst things you could ever do to your community. You became known as an apostate, meaning you gave up your religion, you gave up your people, your community, your monarch.
When Ward converts to Islam, this is a really significant step for him. It's a rejection of the culture that he grew up with in England, and it would have made it difficult for him to return to England. Those sailors who did return to England after converting to Islam were treated with deep suspicion. Apostasy was a sin against the church under church law, and so those sailors had to undergo a very public humiliation and penance in order to re-establish themselves within English society.
In England, these converts were known as renegades, and John Ward was one of the most notorious.
Renegades are Christians who've converted to Islam, and they came to hold some relatively prominent positions within the Ottoman Empire. A lot of them became ship's captains, a lot of them became sailors based out of Ottoman territories, like in Algiers or Tunis, and then they would convert to Islam second. Conversion would perhaps allow them to enjoy a degree of prominence locally, or indeed some of those conversions would have been genuine.
I don't think he was doing it for religious purposes. I don't think he was doing it to please the Dey of Tunis. I think he's doing it to survive, and he's somebody who is not willing to accept his place in life. You know, he's had 50 years of pretty much living in poverty, and that is not the end for him.
In general, this goes for both the Islamic world and the Christian world. Whenever you're trying to make inroads into a civilization or a culture, usually in order for you to conduct business without much hassle, you have to convert. If you were not a Muslim in this case, that means that you, of course, could be raided, you could be captured, and you could even be sold into slavery depending on the context.
By the 1580s, around 50% of the population of Algiers were renegades, formerly Christians. Native Algerians made up a much smaller section of the population. Renegades were a central part of what we can describe as corsairing or piracy, depending upon your perspective, in the Mediterranean in that period. And Ward was one of these. He gets this interesting title bestowed on him of arch-pirate.
Ward's decision to convert becomes the source of speculation, outrage, and even entertainment in England. In 1612, a popular English dramatist composes a play about the notorious pirate. Its title, A Christian Turned Turk.
The play actually portrays his conversion not for economic gain or for social status, which was quite often why English sailors would convert to Islam, but it's actually in the play portrayed as something romantic, so he wants to marry a Muslim woman.
The moment of significance in the play itself was Ward's circumcision. And we know that the audience at the time would have been really just taken aback by this moment, and it was John Ward's sort of symbolic gesture of throwing off his religion. And in some ways, it would have been horrifying to an English community to see this happen.
It would have been something that would have enthralled the audience. It would have been something quite taboo to witness.
To some, Ward is an object of scorn, but to others, he's an inspiration. Hordes of English pirates set sail for the Mediterranean in search of the opulent lifestyle enjoyed by their hero. Some even follow Ward into Islam.
The fact that conversion was seen as quite a simplistic thing for somebody to do over in the Islamic world would have been terrifying for the authorities. It would have been another form of the Ottoman Empire taking over, you know, encroaching on territory by taking souls.
He kills himself in the play in a very dramatic fashion. And what's interesting is clearly this was written by the playwright to sort of dispel the legend of Ward himself, to convince people maybe to not join him and to realize it's a worthless task.
As Ward's legend grows, so does his fleet of corsairs.
He was increasing in wealth all the time, in power. He had hundreds of men working for him.
Really, he becomes a kind of admiral of a private fleet.
And I think, you know, The nature of seafaring at the time was very much that his reputation would spread by word of mouth. He's very successful.
Ward takes on an unlikely new career as a teacher. He operates what is essentially an academy for pirates, instructing the next generation of Barbary corsairs on the finer points of gunnery and navigation.
His men look up to him, and the younger men are being recruited. They are learning from Ward. They are learning from his years at sea and also his operations with piracy in the region.
One reason why John Ward is one of the most infamous pirates in English history was the fact that he provided the technology to North African city-states that allowed them to transform ships that were more coastal oriented to actually be able to sail out into the ocean. And for the first time, corsairs sailed in the Atlantic. Before John Ward, North African communities not only used galleys, which were ships that required oars or sweeps, but one of the reasons why they plundered for and to enslave people was to actually keep manning those ships to be able to provide the labor to allow those ships to cruise along coastlines.
He introduces North Atlantic sailing ships to Tunis and the North African corsairs. These square-rigged round ships that are so much more effective in the North Sea and the Atlantic. And as a sailor who had spent much of his career at sea, as a sailor who's in his 50s before he becomes a pirate, Ward would certainly have been very knowledgeable about the workings of these ships.
By 1612, Ward has retired from piracy and is enjoying the fruits of his illicit labour. He settles into a life of opulence in his Tunisian palace, surrounded by servants and liberal supplies of strong alcohol. The elderly pirate can now enjoy the hobbies and luxuries unimaginable for a poor fisherman from Kent.
In 1616, the Scottish traveller William Lithgow meets Ward and describes him living in this amazing palace, beautified with alabaster and marble. And his reputation is as somebody who's incredibly successful at what he does. He has got an unimaginable wealth and riches. It's been said that he sent money home to his English wife. But also, it seems that he also married when he was in Tunis, so had a wife in Tunis as well. There's reports towards the end of his life that he's pottering around in his palace with his chickens, and he was obsessed with trying to incubate eggs in camel dung.
But peace hasn't come easy. Hunted for the past 2 decades, the aging arch-pirate has seen off assassination attempts from sea captains, diplomats, and trained killers. None succeed. Instead, it's a faceless enemy, the plague, which finally captures Ward. In 1622, he dies in his palace at the age of 70, having enjoyed one of the longest, most remarkable lives of any pirate of the era. Even in death, Captain John Ward's legacy continues on. The North African pirates he helped train are more than capable of sailing beyond the Mediterranean. Hard-nosed Barbary slave traders now operating as far afield as Northern Europe.
When it comes to the study of slavery in the modern world, a lot of emphasis is placed on the transatlantic slave trade because of the impact that it had on the Americas and also on the European powers that were involved in the trade. However, there was an Arab slave trade that took place long before the transatlantic slave trade, which really sort of takes off in the 16th century going into the 17th century.
They would capture these people and send them back to the North African city-states to be enslaved, to work as labor, either on the forts or in the harbor itself. Between 1530 and 1780, we know there are about 1 to 1.25 million Europeans enslaved in North Africa. I think this is important because it highlighted for many the hypocrisy of African slavery in England. Many were aware that as people complained bitterly about their brethren being enslaved to Africans, that they themselves were enslaving Africans. We also know that there's stories of corsairs sailing up the Thames as far as London, apparently stealing someone and kidnapping them from their bed.
Many people died, many people were enslaved. Some captives escaped, some converted to Islam like Ward.
In June 1631, corsairs sailed their square-rigged ships to Ireland. They stormed the small harbour village of Baltimore in County Cork in one of the largest, boldest seizures of European slaves in history.
As for the raid on Baltimore, they captured roughly 109 individuals who were living in the village at that stage. Many of them were English settlers, and they were taken off then to the slave markets, essentially, of Algiers. White slavery and white captives was very much the cargo of choice by the corsairs at that stage. They went in search of human cargo, and they captured them and they took them back to feed the slave markets of North Africa.
In his 70 years, John Ward lived many lives. A simple fisherman, a private man of war, a deserter, a Barbary corsair, a teacher, an Englishman, an Ottoman, a Christian and a Muslim. In the eyes of his countrymen, he was the most infamous infidel of the age. But to the men he commanded, Ward was a marvel of reinvention. The ageless pirate who defied fate and died like a lord.
I think what's important to understand with John Ward was the opportunity that was presented to him, which is that he could remain a poor sailor on the coast of England, or he could go to North Africa where he'd become head of a navy. It's a pretty remarkable situation to go from essentially nothing to becoming a powerful figure. He knew how to sail into the ocean. He had an understanding of how to actually build and construct ships. It made sense for them to raise him up to a position of authority, something he never would have been able to possess or probably ever obtain if he stayed home in England. He's famous as a renegade apostate, someone who left his community and his religion for greed, for power. He was willing to join a community that represented the sort of worst of all piracy. This is one reason why John Ward was so famous and legendary. He's not remembered, I think, today as much, but during his own time period, he was extremely famous.
The legend of John Ward grew through the word of playwrights and poets, whose work was inspired by the Pirate King for decades to come. One of the most famous ballads depicts Ward at the height of his power and ambition. In it, he defeats a mighty English ship, then gloats in characteristic fashion. Go tell the King of England, go tell him thus from me, if he reigns king of all the land, I will reign king at sea.